Some words have been changed to abide by YouTube censorship. Reference materials include Duplicity by Paul T Goldman, published 1999, and the miniseries Paul T Goldman, released in 2023 on Peacock. On August 6, 1999, it's Paul's 40th birthday, but he was not a happy person. He sat in his gray cubicle at work and believed his life was passing him by. Everyone around him was married and had children, but he had not found success with dating during the time he lived in Orange County, California for 16 years. As a transplant from Rhode Island, he assumed women there were not interested in a man who worked for meager wages processing insurance policies. His co-workers had some fun at his expense and brought him black balloons, a cake, and an adult diaper they left on his chair. Another co-worker, Rob, asked him to come over to his house and see his wife and kids since they always loved to see him. Paul thanked him, but he said he planned to have a quiet evening at home reading. He drove the 7.3 miles home from work to his home and spent the 40 minutes in traffic reflecting on his life. He assumed he would have accomplished so much by the time he reached his age, but there he was, stuck in a life that gave him nothing to look forward to. As he opened the door, his dog Basil greeted him, but there was something else that caught his attention in the mail. On the cover of a booklet titled Russian Brides was a beautiful woman named Tatiana. He claimed in his book that he had no idea how his name made its way to their mailing list, but there's a possibility Paul did request the booklet himself and was too ashamed to admit he was willing to resort to buying a wife. He perused through the pages of the catalog, and that's what he called it, a catalog, and was intrigued by all the beautiful women staring back at him. Paul called the number, and a man with a strong Russian accent answered. He said his name was Greg Mardoff, and he was the owner of Russian Brides. He and his wife immigrated to Virginia 5 years ago, and they help Americans find beautiful Russian women to marry. He asked Paul his name and age and was not concerned to hear 40 years old. Greg assured him that Russian women prefer older men, and since they aren't exposed to all the comforts Western women have, he would find Russian women less materialistic and obsessive about having things. Plus, they are almost always highly educated, but they believe in the traditional roles of women and would be submissive. Greg said the Russian Bride Agency screened all the women at their office. Their office manager, Natasha, ran a professional operation and questioned the women on videotape about what they were looking for in a man. Paul would choose from the women he wished to correspond with, and when he was ready, he could fly to Moscow. They gave him an apartment for a week, and he met the women at their office. If he decided to bring a woman to America, then the agency would help with all their paperwork. Paul claimed the idea of making such a significant decision in a week did not occur to him at the time. He immediately was sold on the idea, and he gave Greg his address to receive the videotape. If he liked any of the women, he could fax Greg with an introduction about himself and what he was looking for in a woman. The fax would go to Natasha, and she passed it on to the women Paul chose. If they were interested, and certainly they would be interested, then they could contact Paul directly. He said there were some lingering doubts in the back of his mind as he flipped through the catalog. And again, that's what he called it, a catalog. He said each image showed a woman more beautiful than the last, and his newly sprung hope was only slightly shaded by some reasonable doubt. Could these women really be beautiful, smart, and looking for someone like him? Paul was giddy with excitement when he received his package from Virginia and immediately jammed the videotape into the VCR. Please tell us a little bit about yourself, Natasha asked. My name is Olga, and I'm 35 years old. I work as secretary in office. I have college degree. I sensitive, sociable, honest, intelligent, understanding, romantic, without bad habits. I like home comfort. What kind of things do you like to do for fun? The woman's voice asked a second question. I love theaters, museums, and visiting different exhibitions. I go in for sports, especially swimming. What kind of man are you looking for? I would like to meet a man with great personality and generous heart. Thank you for coming in today, Olga. Paul found the second woman more beautiful than the first. The same woman's voice asked again, "Please tell us a little bit about yourself." "My name is Svetlana, and I'm 29 years old. I'm very sincere, tender, and understanding. I have good sense of humor, good taste, appeasable, and balanced character. I have the work that I like, have many interests. More time passes, more I realize I miss main thing in life. Family I might have, if I meet special person who I will love with all my heart and who will love me." "Very nice. What do you do for fun?" "I'm not sportsman, but I like spending time with bike and swim. I like needlework and reading, planting of flowers, and of course I like any trip." "What kind of man are you looking for?" "I look for a well-educated man, 40 to 50 years, who values family and loves children." "Thank you, Svetlana, for coming in today," the disembodied voice on the other end of the lens remarked. As each woman appeared on the screen, Paul had trouble distinguishing one beautiful Russian woman from the next, so he made copious notes about each one. He said their outlook seemed so simple and honest, and there was a freshness to them that absolutely bowled him over. Really, all the women appeared to be the exact same way, rather young, beautiful, intelligent, and more importantly, traditional females eager to please the man who would choose them. He convinced himself that he had every right to find someone in an unconventional way, and over a course of 3 months he corresponded with 3 women, Svetlana, Irina, and Katya. Although Paul enjoyed all 3 women, he said he felt a special connection to Svetlana, the Eastern beauty over 10 years his junior. By December he was flying to Moscow to meet the woman of his dreams. The long flight gave his mind time to question his actions, and it was crazy trying to commit to a lifetime partner in 1 week. The couples he knew dated for years before marrying, but that didn't guarantee they remained happily married. If he didn't find someone, then he had to return home to his gray cubicle and his unhappy life. Somehow Paul believed this one choice would automatically change everything in his life. He experienced a culture shock landing in Russia for the first time. Accustomed to sunny climate, he underestimated the cold weather of Eastern Europe and wore his sneakers and a coat hardly warm enough for Russia in December. He was grateful to spot the middle-aged Natasha holding a sign with his name on it. "Welcome to Moscow, Paul," she said warmly. "I'm Natasha, the office manager for Russian brides." Standing behind her was the reason Paul traveled there. The tall, beautiful Svetlana was unmistakable to him. He told her she was more beautiful than her pictures, and no doubt she was. She felt she already knew him from their letters and phone calls, and Natasha directed them to her car to break the awkwardness between them. They dropped him off to stay at a plain gray apartment for a week, and he met Svetlana at an office before joining her for dinner in an Italian restaurant. Paul sensed when he met her that she fluttered her eyes and seemed to like him. At the restaurant, he reached over to hold her hand, and she pulled back momentarily. He asked her what was wrong, and she told him it was just her. He played that scene over and over again in his head until he came to an obvious conclusion. Svetlana did not really want him, and she was just spending time with him to escape her dismal existence in Russia. Paul said TV shows from the West depicted America as a dreamland, and these beautiful Russian women only had drunk men to choose from who treated them like expendable housekeepers and care providers. Paul knew these women were desperate when he traveled there, and he hoped to find a beautiful goddess who would be appreciative of the life he could provide in a way an American woman would not need to be because she had her own power in life. Paul wanted a trophy wife. He knew they were desperate, but for some reason He also wanted to believe she also found him attractive, which seemed unreasonable. He told Natasha after a few days that he was rejecting Svetlana, and she immediately came up with a new woman. She handed him a card and explained Talia was Jewish. It's understandable he would not assume to find a Jewish woman in Russia, since the Jewish population there is small. Paul looked at her photo and declared she wasn't very pretty, but he agreed to meet with her. In person, he said she was much cuter at 5'5" in black curly hair to her shoulders. Best of all, Talia was very affectionate with Paul and laughed often. No doubt Natasha warned her about the mistake Svetlana made, and she really put on a show in a way most Northern European people do not act towards someone when they are just getting to know them. Paul only had 2 days left, so she invited him to meet her parents, and he believed since he didn't get lost finding their apartment, it was a good sign for their relationship. Talia assured him she came from virtuous people, and he noticed her mother still looked very good for her age, and Talia was a replica of her. That was very important to Paul. He expected her to still look good as she aged. Her parents were just as affectionate as their daughter, with the permanent smile on her face. Her father asked what he did for a living, and they drank vodka together. The next day he let Natasha know that they were engaged, and Talia rode with them when Natasha brought him to the airport. If he had not found his dream woman, then he would have returned to the gray walls of his cubicle without any hope for changing his life and reaching any kind of success. He expected a marriage to a beautiful woman would complete him and save him from his misery, as she no doubt shared the same delusion. It was her turn to fly to California on a fiancé visa, and Paul told her their life together would be a lot of work, and Talia said she was fine with that as long as she was with him. It seemed he had other expectations. In the book, he wrote, "If I couldn't find the love I was seeking, then at least I'd have a gorgeous woman to wake up next to every morning, a beautiful companion to show off to my friends and family. However, what I was coming home with was far greater than this. I had met a woman with whom I felt a developing love, a love that was also being returned. Most of all, I felt I had found the one thing that had eluded me for so long: happiness. I was happy being someone's knight in shining armor. I was happy to have someone with whom I could communicate more than just superficial ideas. And I was also happy knowing that I was about to become part of something bigger than myself, a family of my own." There's an article in the National Library of Medicine titled, "Can Seeking Happiness Make People Happy? Paradoxical Effects of Valuing Happiness." This was published in final editing for As Emotion, August 11, 2011. Happiness is a crucial ingredient of human well being and health, and therefore, people generally value happiness. Indeed, in an acknowledgment of its value, the pursuit of happiness was identified as an inalienable right in the U.S. Declaration of Independence. However, there is substantial variation in the extent to which people value happiness. Whereas some view it as a nice thing to have every now and then, others see it as a sine qua non of their existence. The current investigation examines how such differences in valuing happiness affect people's actual happiness and well being. Here's a problem with this medical article and this mentality of tying happiness to levels of achievement. It's tied to the hedonic state, or a temporary, subjective emotional experience characterized by pleasure or pain, often representing a person's affective well being. It's relating to moods, feelings, and attitudes. The article found that valuing happiness can lead to less happiness, but that's because people are using the idea of happiness or achieving goals to fill a void inside of them where a foundation of well being should be. Happiness stems from well being. There's a difference between wellness and well being. Wellness is the pursuit of choices and lifestyles that create our health. Well being encompasses our minds, our bodies, our spirits, and our communities. It's what brings us contentment and purpose and helps us cope with life challenges and helps us to bounce back. The World Health Organization defines well being as a positive state experienced by individuals and societies. That positive state is a good, enduring, unchanging, and stable condition that lasts for an indefinite period of time. That level of well being cannot be found in someone else. It has to be found inside of you. Paul thought he would achieve happiness someday by reaching these goals, but he didn't have the level of well being and wellness inside of him he should have found before tying his life to someone else. Even worse, he also sought to control the well being of others, believing that too would bring him happiness. In the first 6 months of 2000, Paul navigated all the paperwork needed for the fiancé paperwork while he continued to talk to Talia 2 to 3 times a week. Once granted, Talia was able to fly to California for an extended stay, and he redecorated his home in her honor. He was able to take a week off from work, and they enjoyed spending time together. She had ideas of what a great American existence would be she formed from watching TV shows in Russia, and after that first week together, it seemed the newness of their shared life would not really live up to her expectations. Paul claimed Talia assumed his home would be more modern and more luxurious. In truth, what we call passport bros now, these guys do go to these more impoverished countries and sell themselves as being wealthier than they really are to impress these younger and naive women. They use the awe of these women to build themselves up, and Paul's reality was not what Talia had imagined. She should have questioned if he was such a great guy, why didn't American women want him? And because she lived with her parents, Talia still relied on them to survive, and she didn't know how to cook. She expected to go out frequently to eat and did not care for Paul's cooking. She expected Paul to pay and update her Russian wardrobe to the new California style, and she quickly realized Paul's income was more modest than she was led to believe. Talia nagged about the things she was unhappy with as she became more accustomed to their new life. She spent all day at the medical library studying to become a doctor in America, and Paul claimed her studies became more important than their relationship. She slept in a guest bedroom because she was used to sleeping alone, and she rejected many of his advances. Paul returned home one day to find a trail of blood in the kitchen, but he couldn't find Talia anywhere. She returned home later with a bandage wrapped around her wrist and said she had an accident. She refused to eat anything he prepared, and he believed she had an ED. This went on for 2 months, and Paul had one more month to marry Talia, or she would have to go back to Russia. He angrily told her one day he was sending her back to Moscow, and Talia became concerned. He yelled at her about her nagging and not wanting to share a bed with him. He said they didn't have a relationship and she was using him for a green card, which he must have known from the start was her goal. Talia said it wasn't true, that she loved him and everything would be better between them. And it was, for about a week. Paul was thinking of returning her to Russia like a piece of clothing ordered in the wrong size, and said she would be damaged goods after going to bed with him. It was ridiculous to believe he would find some woman in another country to satisfy his desires. In the end, people are people, no matter where we live in the world, and we are all searching for the same things. The difference was Paul controlled Talia's well being and threatened to take her security away from her whenever he was dissatisfied with her. That level of control would most likely be missing for Paul if he were attached to an American woman. Then he received a strange phone call. A man on the other end introduced himself as Roy Higgins and explained he got his number from Greg Mardoff at Russian Brides. He said he lived over in Costa Mesa and had recently married Svetlana. Would he like to come over with Talia to a barbecue? Paul said he would have to check with his wife, and he said his wife, but it sounded great to him. The address brought them to a modest apartment building and was a far cry from the cottage Paul owned in Huntington Beach. A tall, slender man in his mid-30s with a southern accent met them at the door with a warm personality. Paul noticed Svetlana had taken quickly with the American lifestyle and had a warmth she didn't have on the few dates they had. As he and Roy talked privately, Paul confided his concerns about their relationship with Talia, of course placing all the blame on her. Roy brushed off the moodiness of the Russian brides as manic depression found in all Eastern European women. He even sang him a song about it. He said when Svetlana acted up, he gave her his full attention, then took her to bed, and she was good for a few days. After dinner, Roy gave Talia a tour of his apartment, and Paul was left alone with Svetlana. She confided in him that Roy told her he was rich, and she assumed they'd be living on a 50-acre ranch in Texas like the Dallas show she watched on TV in Russia. She realized too late that he talked big, but he had nothing. Svetlana would have to get her real estate license to earn her own money. Until then, she said at least the smecks, was good. That reason alone made Paul regret not choosing her over Talia, but it was too late. He married her 3 weeks later, and Paul said his failure was complete. 3 years of his life slipped away in misery as Talia worked toward her medical degree, and she lived like a tenant under Paul's roof. His days were routine until February 2002, when she told him she was pregnant. Paul planned on divorcing her and certainly hadn't planned on getting pregnant during the once-a-month intimacy he said he begged her for. Johnny was born in October 2002, and Paul was very happy to become a father. He claimed to be the only one who cared for their son, while his mother was solely a milk machine. He said he owed it to his son to take a stand and confront Talia. When she received her green card, Paul announced to her that he couldn't stand their marriage anymore. He said he wasn't happy unless it was about Johnny they didn't communicate. They were hardly intimate, and she was disinterested. Paul said she was no longer the girl, and that's what he called her, the girl, he met in Moscow. He was sick of her nagging and complaining. He wanted a divorce. Paul said Talia yelled he was a heartless bastard and threw her food at him, splattering the wall inches from his head. "How could you do this to us?" she asked. "You want to leave your family? You want to leave your son?" Paul said he wasn't going to stay in a loveless marriage for 17 years so Johnny could have two parents living under the same roof. He said her negativity had affected him and he didn't recognize himself anymore. He assured her that he would take care of Johnny when she had to leave to complete her residency in New York. Paul also believed in order to raise him in the best way possible, he would have to find him a new mother. By November 2006, Paul had added his name to the dating site Jewish Singles. He moved to southern Florida, close to where his father and stepmother spent half the year living, and had hope for a new beginning. He brought his son to yet another date at West Palm Beach Mall. He said his job at Metro Insurance Agency as an account manager did not pay much and he couldn't afford a babysitter. Plus, to let the women know Paul was meeting up front, he and Johnny were a package. He was looking for a mother for his son and a partner for him. He hoped from the moment he laid eyes on Audrey she would be the one he was looking for. She bore a likeness to the actress Andie MacDowell with long spiraled brown hair and a slim frame. Audrey was busy on her phone when he first recognized her, but she was graciously waving them to her table when she saw them. Paul said she looked exactly like her online photo, which was rare. Many people end up using outdated photos that made them appear younger and more attractive than they really were. Audrey assured him that she was an honest person. She told him she was a stay-at-home mother to 3 children, a 13-year-old named Annie, an 11-year-old named Davy, and her youngest 2-year-old Tommy. She looked at Johnny and asked him where his mommy was. Paul claimed he usually never talked about his relationship with Talia in front of their son, but he did just that, from Russian brides all the way through the divorce and her New York residency. Audrey was sympathetic to the story he told her and said she heard of men being taken advantage of like him. He noticed how long and slender her fingers were, and he found her appearance perfect except for her glittery nail polish. Paul wanted to know her story. Audrey explained she had been married to Joe Munson for 10 years, and over time their passion vanished. He was a good father, but a lousy husband, immature, disconnected, and uninterested in her. She had a second marriage after Joe. His name was Bob Thompson, and he was a very successful businessman who said he loved her. Then, when their son was born, he told her he didn't want a family and moved away somewhere in New England. He was completely out of their lives except for paying a little child support. He was worth $8 million, but he didn't want to take care of them financially. Audrey's phone went off again, and while she fiddled with it, Paul decided she was what, not who, but what, in his words, he was looking for. They decided to meet at Lucky Chinese Restaurant for a real date, and Paul made sure he was there before Audrey arrived. As he waited, he went over the list of questions in his head as he arranged the sugar packets on the table. Finally, she arrived, and he found her to be as beautiful as their first meeting. Just like him, she had not found success on previous dates she had on Jewish singles. How come? He asked as he spooned soup into his mouth. Without further comment, she answered, I think I told you how important honesty in a relationship is to me. Well, in the interest of honesty, I make it very clear to men that I'm an old-fashioned girl. I don't believe in smecks before marriage. Of course, when I tell a man that, it's usually the last time I see him. She spoke calmly, and her eyes never left Paul. She was reading him, waiting for his reaction to what was normally considered a deal breaker. Paul blew on his soup and took a moment to pull his thoughts together. That was a disappointment. Still, he respected her principles. He wanted more than a playmate. He wanted a woman with high morals to build a life with, for him and for Johnny. Paul wrote, I'm not like most men, I said evenly, meeting her eyes and smiling. I think you're a wonderful person, Audrey, and I see no reason to not wait until we know each other a little better, to have a deep relationship. So tell me, would you like to continue to see me? Sure, you'll do, she remarked, returning to her meal while glancing down to check her cell phone for any voicemails. My smile faded. I'll do? What the hell did that mean? I was suddenly unsure of what I had just been so certain of. I didn't want to simply do for anyone. When Audrey finally looked up at me, she must have guessed the direction of my thoughts from my expression on my face, and she quickly clarified her remark. Oh, silly me, look at your face. Me and my twisted sense of humor. I was kidding, Paul. I'm so looking forward to us getting together again. By January 2007, he was in a car with Johnny taking Audrey to visit her parents. They lived in a temporary home in a Fort Lauderdale condo and were forced out of their home in Huntington Island due to a recent hurricane. They had a semi-argument over directions on the way as Audrey explained her father's father was a successful man who founded a Fortune 500 company. Her father decided not to work in his father's business, but was not clear as to what kind of work he did. Paul couldn't understand why they lived in a modest area of Florida if he came from wealth, but he didn't question Audrey over it. He parked his car near her father's Honda and wondered again why a man from wealth would drive that kind of car. He met Mr. Allen first and found him annoying, although the elderly man seemed very nice to Johnny. Paul said he bragged about himself throughout their visit and didn't show any interest in his daughter or their guests. He found Audrey's mother to be lovely and imagined Audrey would look like her in 20 years. He said in his book, Good Genes, I thought even more pleased with my plans for the future. He saw a closeness between mother and daughter, and they were often huddled together, speaking in her mother's native Spanish. Audrey's parents had been together for 43 years by then. Paul had Audrey come to his home to spend time with him and Johnny. She spent time taking care of her 92-year-old grandmother and spent 4 days a week with her until her aunt relieved her. While she was away, her ex-husband Joe had the children, and the rest of the week they lived at Audrey's parents' damaged condo. Paul couldn't understand why the condo was fit for Audrey and the children to live in when her parents rented a place somewhere else. He said he knew Audrey and her children needed stability and support, and he was ready to give it to her. Audrey was still fidgeting with her phone when they reached her parents' condo where she was living temporarily. He did not feel any real affection from her when they were together, but he said in his book he assumed since she had been married twice before she had every reason to keep her guard up. Mind you, this was the same man who ended it with Svetlana because she pulled away from holding his hand in a restaurant. He did not seem to learn from his past as he dove headfirst into his future. Paul sold his condo home and decided he wanted to operate his own business. It was not a surprise he needed to increase his income if he wanted to be with a woman like Audrey. She was very beautiful, much younger, about a decade, than Paul, and she was expensively dressed. If he wanted her in his life, then he needed to make more money. Paul didn't want to start a business himself. He wanted to buy an ongoing business. He hired a business broker and finally found Daniel. Daniel had relocated from Venezuela 10 years before and began his work as a house painter. He built it from the ground up with hard work and dependability, but found keeping up all the responsibilities impossible. He said he needed help. Paul said he knew in the hours he spent talking to him that he was an honest man, and Daniel had all of his receipts to back him up. His painting business had brought in $1.8 million in 1 year alone. Paul was amazed. He agreed to buy the business from Daniel, but Daniel would remain on as the key employee, the one with all the connections and on-site knowledge. In Paul's business plan, Daniel served as supervisor, making the rounds at the sites, seeking out builders, soliciting new work, hiring employees, and taking referrals. Paul would sit at home at a desk and he would stay in contact with Daniel with a walkie-talkie. He said as a team he expected the business would bring in even more money. Yeah, more money for who? Paul said he felt like a new person now he was a big businessman like his father was. He had a 10-year goal set up for himself when he finally had the financial security he wanted for the rest of his life. He met Audrey for dinner at the cafe where they first met. He noticed how stunning she looked, and he was proud she was with him. After dinner, he asked her if she wanted champagne. Champagne? What for? She asked. Audrey, I know we haven't known each other that long, but I'm in love with you, and I want us to be like your parents. Marry quickly and stay married forever. Will you marry me? I leaned in and clutched her hand in mine. I stared at her intently as my mind raced. Not knowing what to expect, I searched her eyes for some reaction, any reaction. Yes, Paul, I will, she said matter-of-factly. My joy over her acceptance was not at all marred by her emotionless response. I jumped out of my seat, scooped her out of her chair, and kissed her. The crowd in the restaurant faded away, and I was lost in the moment. Audrey, a little less comfortable in our public display, pulled away and smiled. Of course I will. What a wonderful surprise, Paul. I'm really happy. He drove her back to her parents' condo and finally brought up the intimacy barrier in their relationship. So, honey, I was wondering how you might feel about reconsidering your premarital sex rule. I mean, now that we're engaged and, well, you know I'm fully committed to you. I stumbled along, my thumbs tapping the steering wheel. Audrey didn't even seem to be listening. She was rummaging through her purse in search of her keys. I mean, I love you and I want to be with you in every way, and oh, there they are, she said, freeing her keys from her cluttered bag. And then finally turning her attention to me, she responded, I know what you're saying and you're right. I guess I'd be okay with that too. Disbelieving that my awkward attempt at persuasion had actually been a success, I was just about to reassure Audrey of my sincerity when I was interrupted by her hand on my belt buckle. Move the seat back, Paul, was her directive. Before Paul knew what was happening, there was a flurry of kissing and movement, then it was all over. Audrey readjusted her clothes while he was left feeling unsatisfied. He said he couldn't understand how someone who had put such a high value on intimacy could be so indifferent when it really happened. Again, he thought she had been previously married twice and believed Smex had lost some of its meaning for her. Perhaps they should have waited until their wedding day. When Paul told Johnny about the marriage, he said his son asked if he could call her Mommy too. Then Paul played with him, as he often did, just like a child's playmate. Audrey pointed out to him that their new family would be too small for Paul's house in Boynton Beach, and it was too far away from the children's private schools. He found a home he liked online and sent Audrey the details, which she approved. It had 5 bedrooms and 4 bathrooms, room for all of them. Paul called his brother Dave with exciting news. Hey, I'm engaged, he announced. Excuse me, he replied. How long have you known this girl? A girl, a woman in her 30s, twice married and divorced with 3 children. Paul explained they knew each other a few months, but they wanted the same things in life, and he wasn't getting any younger. He could tell his brother was skeptical. Paul said Dave told him not to put this woman's name on the house deed unless she was willing to split the down payment with him. Talia warned him to protect Johnny's financial future. And although they were both looking out for Paul in Johnny's best interest, it's doubtful Paul needed either one of them to warn him about trusting Audrey. It's obvious he doesn't trust women from the beginning, and it has to do with the way he chooses his wives. They were women he knew who were in bad situations, and they were looking for someone to save them financially. Paul let Audrey know that he expected her to contribute half of the down payment in order to be half owner. She wanted to know how long they would have to be married before her name would be added to the deed. Paul was upset she wanted to know that. Then Audrey got mad and ghosted him for weeks. Paul continued to email her and ask for a compromise. She finally responded and reminded him she told him up front what the financial arrangement was for her, and she was honest right from the start. She was looking for a man to take care of her and her children financially, and she was with him intimately because she believed he would provide that security for her. She was being paid $5,000 a month by her family to take care of her grandmother, and that covered her bills. Audrey wanted information about his business revenue and doubted Paul made enough money to take care of them. She was doubting their relationship would succeed. She said he would have to accept a part-time marriage, and Paul said a part-time marriage was better than no marriage. He had returned to Jewish singles looking for someone as he and Audrey fought over their future for months, but only found failure. Perhaps they could make it after all. They married at the Palm Beach County Courthouse in September 2007. Paul brought Johnny and his key employee, Daniel, with him. Audrey said her parents could not make it because they were in a car accident. Are they okay? Paul asked. Audrey said they were fine, but could not make the wedding. He found out then that his new bride would not be taking his last name. Why not? He wanted to know. She told him this was her forever marriage. It would be too confusing for the children, she explained flatly. Paul pointed out the children had different fathers and different last names. Audrey still refused. Paul said he felt like backing out but didn't. They became husband and wife and went to eat at a restaurant at a nearby waterway. After dinner, they brought out a three-tiered cake Paul had custom ordered, and they went home to Jupiter Lakes for their honeymoon. He decorated their bedroom with candles and rose petals, and after the night together, Audrey left to take care of her grandmother. While she was away, Paul read a card she wrote to him over and over. Love is a gift to cherish. There is a mutual spark and a magical touch. An everlasting friendship has begun. They share happiness and sorrow. Many challenges lie ahead. Thoughts are shared. Compromises are made to meet each other's wants and needs. Like best friends, even without quantity, there is always quality time together. Marriage is a partnership. It's a commitment between two people who are joining their life's treasures, no matter how big or small. Two families grow into one. There is a constant desire to enjoy the pleasure of growing old together while watching the young ones journey through life. With you, Paul, this is what I see and feel. The love I have is unconditional. May the seeds we plant today blossom into our garden for all to share and enjoy. Within a few months of marriage, Paul announced to his new family over pizza that he wanted to buy another house. He said he wanted to buy one in California, another home to escape the Florida heat in the summer. But it's just as hot in California in the summer as it is in Florida. Oh well. Audrey asked about his work, and Paul said he could run his business long distance since it was actually Daniel doing all the work running the business. He contacted the same broker who sold his California home, and he said he was an honest and thorough man. He decided a home in Saratoga Ranch would give them a modern townhouse near activities for the children. Paul told Audrey about the house, and she approved. He said he wanted to make an offer. An offer, she questioned. He said the house was underpriced and he wanted it. She wanted to go see the house before they bought it, which seemed reasonable. Paul said they didn't have to see it. He trusted the broker, and he was going to buy it. Audrey wanted a say in buying another house and didn't want to be treated as just some stay-at-home mom who doesn't know anything. They became angry with each other, and she pointed out how he jumped into things without thinking, just like their marriage. He pointed out she married him too, and issues in the relationship began to surface. Audrey did not want to rush into the sale, but Paul said he lived in Orange County before and knew real estate, so he was buying the house. End of discussion. Audrey walked away from him in disgust. This is what Paul wrote. At that moment, part of me hated her. It was just for a moment, a burst of hatred that came upon me as quickly as it left, but it was strong. I hated what she was doing to me, making me feel desperate, powerless, and constantly uncertain about what may come next. More than anything, I hated how far from perfect we were proving to be, despite working so hard to make our new life everything I'd hoped. The following week, they were at the loan office to sign paperwork for the new home. Audrey said she couldn't be on the loan. Why not? Paul asked. She claimed that her ex-husband Joe ruined her credit and she would make the interest rates higher if she co-signed for the loan. Paul agreed to sign the papers alone. Great, said Audrey. She would not be on the loan, but she would be on the house title. Then she went to the ladies' room. For Hanukkah, Audrey decorated the house, and they had a party for their family and some friends. Paul's father and his stepmother, Helen, arrived, and she asked Paul how the marriage was going. Why do women always do that, he wondered. Because Helen knew how Paul was, and she knew he had previously failed at marriage. She also knew how much work there was in keeping a marriage together, and she must have doubted her stepson's marriage would last over time. So she asked, hoping for some insight, but all he said was that it was great. By New Year's Eve, the marriage was unstable again. Audrey was with her grandmother and planned to drive in to stay with Paul to see the New Year in. Paul had dinner and wine waiting for her, but she kept calling, claiming to be late for one reason and then another. She didn't return that night, and Paul went to bed hoping it wasn't a bad omen for the new year. He was wrong. It was a bad omen. Weeks later, Paul and Audrey were on a flight to California to see the home he bought. Audrey finished off 2 vodka tonics and started a conversation with 2 golfers seated near them. Although she tried to include him in the conversation, Paul became angry and pouted because she was giving them attention and not him. Later, he noticed she was looking back before the plane landed, and when he looked in the same direction Audrey was looking, he saw one of the golfers looking away just as Paul saw him. He had their whole agenda figured out as usual, and he wanted to show her what he knew about living in Orange County. They approved of the home, which was a good idea because he already bought it, and spent 2 days together. During a stop at a sandwich shop, Audrey announced she wanted to talk to Paul, and he had this feeling of a plummeting roller coaster heading toward disaster. She told him she didn't want to have as much smacks with him anymore. They had been together for 2 days, and she thought once a week was enough. She said his smacks drive was abnormal. He said there was nothing abnormal with a man who wanted to be with the wife he loved. They only saw each other 3 times a week. She wouldn't budge, and neither would he. He said he was not interested in a celibate marriage, and if she didn't want to make love to him, then she didn't want to be married to him. Paul shouted when they returned to Florida they would either live as a normal husband and wife full time, or she could go back to living in her parents' condo, and they would get a divorce. They had another separation with Paul calling her, but she wouldn't answer. Finally, she sent him an email letting him know she deposited $5,000 into their joint account for her bills with a schedule for the days they spent together, which included specs time at 5 a.m., daily walks, weekly or bi-weekly visits to the synagogue, weekly dinners with family, and bedtime at 8:30 p.m. She offered to end her job so they would not be spending most of the week apart, which Paul wanted. Audrey moved back in and Paul made dinner. They went to bed together, and she told him all she wanted was to be a happy family. They needed to share everything together, which meant having her name on his business and his 2 Florida houses. Paul refused. He said maybe after they had a full-time marriage for a few years. Audrey said she wanted it now. He got angry and slept downstairs. On Valentine's Day, Audrey sent him an email telling him not to contact her until he had arranged for them to be an equal family. Paul looked up divorce lawyers and made an appointment for the next day. He told him the whole story and was thrilled when his new lawyer agreed she was a gold digger. He convinced Paul to fight a 200-year-old law that stated a marriage cannot be annulled if it was consummated. The lawyer said it was made to protect virgins and not 3 times divorced mothers of 3. He said it would create a new case law, no doubt for a big price, too. Paul fell for it just like everything else. He wrote the initial check for $5,000 and told Paul to change the locks on his house. But he changed his mind by the time he returned home and left her a voicemail. Honey, it's Paul. I'm sorry that I had to do what I felt needed to be done. Now that said, I simply don't understand your words and actions, and I don't understand why you refuse to discuss the situation. You know, lots of couples, even while a divorce has been filed, go to counseling. Why don't we go to counseling? Let's talk all of this out, because I think this is a case of miscommunication, and we can resolve this and get our marriage back on track. Let me know if you want to set up counseling. I love you. In February 2008, their separation began. Paul said he was lonely, and they wrote emails back and forth fighting with each other. They were both exhausted emotionally and psychologically and needed some form of mediation. By the end of June, they were meeting with a marriage counselor. They met with her together, and then later they met with her separately. Paul wanted to talk first, and he complained Audrey wanted her name added to the homes and business after only being married for 3 months in a part-time relationship, which is true. For her part, she said he treated her like a stranger and not as an equal wife. He threw them out of the house whenever he was angry, and she said he wanted a Smex slave. The counselor asked Paul if he thought he and Audrey should be together. He said at the time he did, but admitted later to thinking the question over and not being sure. When they met together again, it seemed some tension in the relationship had dissipated, and they sat together on the same couch rather than on opposite sides of the room. Audrey agreed to drop her demands to have her name added to the properties and the business, since a marriage over time would give her what she wanted. She also agreed to waive the 1 time a week for smacks, and Paul believed he won in the end. He said she agreed to a normal, intimate, long-term marriage with him. Audrey had some financial obligations she needed him to meet. She wanted Paul to give her $600 a week for maintenance on the home, as well as pay $6,300 for Florida health insurance to cover herself and her children, and $13,640 for her student loan. Why were the children's fathers paying for their medical care? Paul said to give him the documents and he would take a look at them. With that, Audrey and the children moved back into the Jupiter Lakes home. They made love that night, but Audrey told him the arrangement for Smex at 5:45 a.m. would be their new beginning. When he woke up the next morning and wanted to do it again, she told him the night before counted as their usual morning Smex. Paul went back to sleep and woke to find Johnny and Audrey had already eaten without him. Audrey had printed out the checks for him to sign and told him she was told by the student loan people they could put a lien on the home for what she owed. Paul said that didn't sound right because her name wasn't on the title, and she said again that's what she was told. Paul said he was concerned because Daniel wasn't bringing in the same amount of contract work he once brought in, and he called the builders himself since he obviously didn't trust Daniel, but was assured that new construction had slowed down. He was paying mortgages on 3 homes and was trying to rent or sell 2 of them to no avail. Audrey seemed to be stalling when it came to firing her divorce attorney. She claimed she was so busy she forgot to. Later on, she said her lawyer needed to be paid a retainer to drop the case. Paul didn't like the 5:45 a.m. time for the intimacy and believed he was being serviced, and then set on to go about his day, which sounds correct. It was something she didn't enjoy, and she treated it like a chore she did right when she woke up to get it out of her way. She was no longer taking care of her grandmother, and financially it was up to him to take care of her as he requested she do. Paul was called by a foreman, Jose, working on one of his projects. He was told the painters had not been paid in nearly a month and were threatening to quit. The invoices said they were paid last week. Jose told him he needed to get down there. Daniel had partially paid the workers with promises of future payoffs, then ran off with his girlfriend, Maria. His wife, Lana, and their baby daughter were left behind to fend for themselves. He had to fulfill his obligations to the painters, and later heard rumors that placed Daniel back in Venezuela. As for Paul, that was probably one of the few times he had appeared at any work site, and certainly he had never bothered to meet his employees before. Without Daniel, his business went under because he had no idea how to operate it himself. It lasted less than 2 years. Paul complained in his book he felt used by everyone, Talia, Daniel, and Audrey, but he doesn't seem to see how he used them just as much as a means to an end. Daniel did all the real work in the business, and his 2 wives were in his life to satisfy his own needs and wants. These were transactional relationships, and they knew that from the very beginning. Paul angrily declared he was treated poorly and was a fool, and he would stand up to them for his and Johnny's sake. Audrey told him she had another medical bill for $1,300.50 for female tests, and she asked him to make it out to FLHC again, Florida Health Company, Instead of just writing FLHC, he wrote the check in the full name and sent it in the mail Friday. The next day, Audrey let him know the company would not process the check because it wasn't made out to FLHC. Paul didn't think that sounded right, plus he knew there was no way they received the check in just one day in the mail. Paul decided to visit the insurance agent himself and found the address Audrey gave him. He didn't find an office complex, but a sign that read Stewart Trailer Park. He found a rundown site that smelled of urine and garbage. At the address, he found a trailer with a cracked window and a for sale by owner sign with Audrey's cell phone number on it. He checked with the park manager and found out Audrey wanted to sell the trailer for $20,000, but probably could not get that much for it. Her father had bought it for her so she and the children would always have a home. Paul waited for Audrey to return home, and he told her the game was up, no doubt something he heard from watching some kind of true crime show. Audrey left without saying a word, and Paul hired another divorce lawyer. Their new beginning lasted all of 4 weeks, and he changed the locks on his house again. This did not prevent her from getting into the house through the garage door and taking some necessities. Audrey was driving a 1997 Honda Accord under Paul's company name. Was she an employee for Paul's company? No. Paul was pulling a fast one, using company expenses for personal use. They went to court and Audrey was told to return the car at a certain date. She waited until the last moment to leave the car in the driveway with the engine still running and the doors locked. Paul had an additional set of keys, and when he opened the car, he found it gutted. Even the seats were removed, and the outside had been keyed. Paul was ordered to pay $750 a month in temporary spousal support, and he complained he did not have a job and his business went under. It was far less than the $6,000 a month Audrey asked for, and less than the $5,000 a month she needed to meet her expenses when Paul pushed her to quit her job in order to be there for him full time. The judge eyed Paul leerily, because he had probably seen plenty of men in a court who suddenly had no money just as a divorce came up. He told Paul to get another job and not to be choosy about the work. As for Audrey, she was receiving $1,600 a month total in child support and had 2 degrees but didn't work outside the home. Paul brought her back to court for the car, and Audrey dropped the seats off in the driveway before the court date. The judge would rule on the car damage when they had the final divorce hearing. Paul was angry it wasn't dealt with more harshly and immediately. He claimed Audrey's second husband called him and wanted to meet him at the local IHOP. Paul was told by Audrey that Bob Thompson lived in Connecticut, but he lived about a mile from him and had since Tommy was born 3 years ago. Bob told him over breakfast that he met her in a restaurant in Palm Beach, and he knew she was there to pick up a guy. They had dinner together and started dating for a few months. The thing is, he knew her deal. He knew from the very beginning she was looking for a man with money who would hand over money to her so she could afford her life. And then he acted so insulted when she expected him to do just that. Does he stay away from her once he realizes this is who she really was? No. He asked her to move in with him. Then he realized some things she told him were a lie. He said he found out from her father that Audrey didn't come from wealth, and he realized she was a scammer. The reason she told him she was from wealth was to possibly make him believe that she was just interested in him and not his money, since she had money of her own. By the time he found out the truth, they would be involved for some months, and maybe she would care enough about her not to care if she didn't have her own money. Just like with Paul, Audrey wanted her name put on some of Bob's assets. Just like Paul, he refused. And by now, since Bob didn't trust her, he certainly would break up with her and not see her again. No, he married her. He said he was ready to break up with her, and he came home one day to her holding balloons with the words, "Just say yes," emblazoned on them. So he did. They hopped on a plane and married in Las Vegas. Bob said they were married for 4 months of endless fighting and mistrust when he informed her that the tech bubble burst and they would have to live on a budget of $100,000 a year. His business went belly up just like Paul's, and at the same time they planned on filing for divorce. Audrey said she never lived on a budget before, so he filed for divorce and moved to Connecticut. She called him a few weeks later to let him know she was pregnant. He had a DNA test done to make sure Tommy was his. Bob said while they were married, Audrey stole money from his wallet and from a coin box where he kept his loose change. She told him they were married and what was his was also hers. He said he normally would agree, but she was very sneaky about it, and she never told him what she needed the money for. After they separated, she went to take his tax returns when he wasn't at home, and she stole a ring his grandfather gave him. Paul also found out Audrey was not spending all of her time in Cocoa Beach with her grandmother. She spent Mondays at her trailer where Bob dropped Tommy off to her. Bob finally lets Paul know that Audrey was suing him and her first ex, Joe, to increase child support. Both men were attempting to get full custody of the children with the argument that she's an unfit mother due to her lifestyle. Bob said she spent time in bars and lived with other men. He hired a private investigator and claimed she lived with 4 different men in 1 month alone. He wanted to know anything from Paul concerning Audrey's treatment of Tommy. Paul met with Audrey and her lawyer to mediate a divorce settlement. She was asking for $100,000 because, under Florida law, the California townhouse is presumed to be a gift and she is entitled to half the equity. His lawyer pointed out the brevity of the marriage and the fact Audrey did not contribute anything to the down payment or mortgage payments. He advised Paul to offer $20,000 since if he went to court, he would pay that easily in legal costs. They refused that offer, but later accepted the possibility of buying the house in Jupiter for $40,000 below market value. Unfortunately, Audrey's father could not swing a loan for her, so they had to go to court. And in the middle of all that mess, Paul decided to call Terry Lynn, a professional pet psychic and medium he contacted a year earlier. I kid you not. He said he considered himself a very spiritual person and he was open to the possibility that some people do in fact possess abilities to sense and see things the rest of us cannot. Paul had 3 dogs, Basil, who passed away, Kingy, then Queenie, who replaced him. Kingy went outside on a rainy day and never returned. She told him on the phone that a woman was driving down his street after having a one-night stand at a guy's house and she picked the dog up. It sounded reasonable to Paul since the dog was only outside for a brief period of time. He found her likable and believable at the time, so he called her to get a reading about his soon-to-be ex-wife. On May 30th, 2009, Paul asked Terry Lynn why Audrey refused to give him back an engagement ring he gave her that supposedly belonged to his mother. It's hard to understand why he would give a woman he knew for 3 months something that valuable to him, but that's what he claimed. Terry said Audrey was not learning what she was here to learn. She assured Paul he would win against her in court and he should prosecute her afterwards for fraud. She told Paul to protect other people from Audrey, and he was a warrior of love. Terry said Audrey was essayed as a child, and she learned to use her body to get what she wanted. She said Audrey was so low and slimy she needed a bath. She also said Audrey looked at her actions like ho-hoing, and since she gave him sexual favors, she deserved payment for it and compared Audrey to a child predator. Terry said to turn her into the IRS. Paul thanked her for the information, then called his attorney to let him know he planned on investigating Audrey. His lawyer had Audrey's bank statements subpoenaed and gave them to Paul. Within hours, Paul was calling his attorney to let him know Audrey had monthly deposits far beyond her child support in ranges of $4,000 to $5,000 each, and random figures that looked like she was receiving deposits from stocks or interest rates from CDs. He also found charges from stores near her trailer when she was supposed to be in Cocoa Beach. When Audrey denied any additional income, Paul became outraged and screamed at his lawyer. He wanted Audrey penalized, but his lawyer said he would ask her about it on the stand when they went to trial. Paul said his lawyer subpoenaed her cell phone records as a matter of course, but Paul was always leery about the time she spent on the phone and wanted to know who she was talking to. He found a repeated number who he assumed was her new boyfriend and found she called him on their wedding night 3 times. Sometimes she called him 10 times a day. He wanted to find out who this guy was, so he Googled his number and found a website for a man selling a boat. The man's name was Royce, and he was a fat, scruffy looking character with a 20-something blonde beside him. He called Bob, and Bob explained Royce was indeed Audrey's boyfriend since 2003. Paul also found out Audrey had an AT&T mailbox for messages and didn't know anything about it. In truth, there was a lot about Audrey Paul didn't know. He called these numbers and nearly all of them came up without information when he Googled them. But he called of the few that did, and usually men picked up the phone. Paul thought he saw a pattern when Audrey would call these men and then call Royce. Although he couldn't find information on most of the calls, he decided Audrey was calling hundreds of men. There were also some women she spoke to. From this, Paul decided that Audrey was a madam and a woman who sold her body for money. This also sprung from the idea of the psychic Terry totem about Audrey being a, ho-ho. He assumed Royce was her PIMP. Paul often became angry and hit things, so when he found that out, he began pounding his computer desk. He said he had images of hurting Audrey, even taking her life. He said no jury would convict him and it would be justified. Paul decided she must have been intimate with at least 1,000 men, and by proxy so had he. He believed it was up to him to bring down Audrey and her hook her ring. Joe Munson called Paul and told him Audrey called him to let him know Paul was calling people she knew and accusing her of being a woman who sold her body for money. Paul said he did call people, but he denied calling Audrey a hook her. There was no way for all these people to come to the same conclusion Paul did when he started calling everyone. Audrey knew unless he was telling them that. Then he started filling Joe in on his investigation of Audrey, knowing he was attempting to take custody of the children away from her. Paul called Bob when he found a rental house phone number, and he assumed it was her Smeck's house. The house was actually rented by the niece of a 70-year-old wealthy man and her 12-year-old daughter, but Bob heard rumors that the house owner paid for women to be with his clients. At that, Paul's mouth dropped open. He decided the 70-year-old house owner found the men who rented the women from Rocco and Audrey, who were male and female versions of each other. All he saw were patterns and cycles dancing around in his head, and he said he was disgusted by such an operation. Paul knew he was onto something big. He said it explained why a stay-at-home mom would be so groomed down there and why she had fake chest pillows. It also explained why she was so impersonal with him in bed without a hint of passion like Jane Fonda in Clute. Paul needed more answers, so he turned to someone he believed would give him what he was searching for. He called pet psychic Terry again. For the second reading on August 11, 2009, he filled her in on his investigation, and she told him Audrey may be involved with conspiracy to commit illegal interstate commerce and fraudulent tax returns. Terry believed Audrey owed about $900,000 in cash stashed between a dozen banks in a brokerage account. She also said she had aliases. Overall, she agreed with all the information he provided her and encouraged him to continue his investigation. Paul said the reason he had been chosen was he would be the one to take Audrey down. Although he said he no longer had a business or a source of income and didn't know how he was going to pay $750 a month in temporary alimony, he hired an investigator just like Bob did to follow Audrey. He initially wanted to join forces with Bob and split the cost, but Bob's lawyers wisely advised against him doing that. He gave the investigator named Joyce everything he knew about Audrey's schedule and where she lived, including her trailer and an apartment she rented in Jupiter so her children could remain in school there. Paul knew she was receiving $1,600 a month in child support, and the lot rent for the trailer was $400 a month, and the apartment rent was $1,000 a month. It was probably the reason Audrey was asking for additional child support. Joyce told Paul he was the most organized and comprehensive client she had ever dealt with, which pleased him. Audrey had the children through the week and their fathers had them on the weekends, so he expected Joyce to find some dirt on Audrey over the weekend. Nothing unusual happened, but the investigators lost track of Audrey most of the time. She went to a bank and Paul said she was making a deposit from all of her money. After Audrey spent the day at a home owned by a 70-year-old man, Paul said that sounded correct since he must have been another PIMP. He decided she was doing all of her book work and arranging tricks for her girls. Joyce said they were really learning Audrey's MO, so Paul continued to hire them. They followed her to a park where she met with two other women and they started to pray. Pray? Paul asked. Hookers praying? The rest of the time she brought her kids back and forth to school and met Royce for lunch. That didn't satisfy Paul, so he made yet another call to Terry, the pet psychic, and asked her to fill him in on what was happening. She told him the 70-year-old man, Tony Sawgrass, was the front man who provided the men and took a percentage, just as Paul said he believed earlier. From the phone logs, he found a man in New York named Vinny Rivera, who did the local distribution. Terry told him this ring was big and he should get law enforcement and an investigative journalist involved. Paul said she was living a double life, but Terry said she was duplicitous. She came up with a man's name, Charlie Watson, and Audrey was involved with him while seeing another man Paul tracked from his phone number, Mark Rogers. Paul tracked down Charlie Watson, and he was living in the Bay Area, which made him trust Terry, the pet psychic, even more. He called the number and a woman answered the phone. He blurted out that he thought Charlie Watson was having an affair with his wife, and the woman just laughed. Charlie was her husband, and they had been happily married for 15 years. She handed the phone to Charlie, and he never heard of Audrey Monson. Paul asked if he was rich, and the Watsons were just laughing hysterically. No, he worked in construction and made about $50,000 a year. He was a 50-year-old biker with long gray hair down to his butt. They hung up, but Charlie called back 15 minutes later. He remembered a rich man named Bill Townsend who kept a stack of business cards of his to give out. Paul decided this rich guy who went out to Palm Beach bars was using Charlie Watson's business cards to disguise himself while he did business with Audrey. Charlie Watson agreed with Paul, and you could see how fast crazy can spread. He had the name of the company Bill Townsend owned and thought he would investigate him later. He called Joyce to let her know that an anonymous source told him Audrey would be making herself and other co-workers available at a hotel convention. He spent the night picturing overweight conventioners with $100 crumpled bills in their hands, leading Audrey up to their hotel rooms. All of it would be captured on video surveillance. But that's not what happened. She dropped Tommy off at his dad's. She bought groceries, and her parents came to spend the night at her place. She got dressed up and went to a bar just a few miles from her that was part of the hotel. She talked to two men, and Paul said the concierge must have known they were looking for a hooker for the night. Then Audrey stood up to shake the hands of the men, and she went home. Paul thought her parents' visit kept her from going to the convention, so she went up the road to make money, but she didn't make any money. Joyce assured him that his instincts were spot on, and it would not be long until they had some hard evidence. Paul told his divorce lawyers all that happened, and he said he needed proof of what was going on. Proof, Paul declared. Haven't you been listening? His attorney didn't see the connection and told Paul he was delusional. The lawyer saw Paul as a desperate man clinging at ideals to explain the demise of his marriage. Paul said he sat down and looked directly into the lawyer's eyes. I'm not delusional, Paul said firmly. He tried to convince his attorney all of it was real with a new message on her cell phone referring to herself as Lady Audrey in a new email. Paul said her voice was very sensual, like one of those 1-900 numbers. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore, he said. His lawyer told him to stay calm until the court day, and Paul said he wouldn't do anything rash. He lied. He made an appointment to talk to a sergeant at the Palm Beach Police Department. Paul gave him a copy of all of his research and told him his wife Audrey was wearing a large hooker ring in and around Palm Beach area. The sergeant never heard of her, and Paul felt deflated by his imperial attitude. He went on to contact Bill Townsend, who was supposed to be using Charlie Watson as an alias. Bill had no idea who Audrey was, and Paul explained to him the entire story in as brief a way as possible. Paul said, well, like I said, I don't know Audrey Watson, but thanks for the warning. Bye, and he hung up. Paul thought it was odd the man listened to him and assumed he did know Audrey, but since he was misrepresenting himself as another man, he may be Audrey's next victim or a satisfied customer. Paul waited a week and a half and called the sergeant back at the police station. He told Paul they would not pursue an investigation. Why not? Paul asked. He said there was not enough activity in the jurisdiction to warrant further investigation. Paul didn't think he intended to call him about it. The sergeant claimed he sent the file to the sheriff's department for review and hung up. Paul said he would not be deterred. There were other police departments, and he went on to talk to a vice officer. When Paul told him about Royce Rocco, he claimed he already knew the PIMP's name. He made plans to meet with them and give them his information. When he told Bob about it, he was informed that Royce knew the Spencer County captain and they were friends, maybe more than friends. Bob told him he called in 2 welfare checks on Audrey when she was a little late dropping off Tommy, and the captain told him to stop harassing Audrey. Bob said unless the captain was benefiting from her services, she wouldn't know the captain personally, so she must have called Royce and had him contact one of his buddies on the inside. With that, Paul said there was no way he was walking into that police station and turned to his pet psychic for advice and support. He felt he had a solid team to take down Audrey, his lawyer, his detective, and his pet psychic and medium. In another reading on September 28, 2009, Terry talked him through how he would confront Audrey with her human trafficking ring. He wanted it to seem like he was just there for the divorce, but he planned on spilling evidence about who she really was. Terry saw Audrey's end of life in the future, and she was cut with a knife in a hotel room. Terry said she thought she was protected because she was paying off the police and they were looking for more violent crimes. She said it was Paul's job to stop her from continuing to prey on others. She didn't care about anyone, including her kids. Paul said he went to a website Terry told him called Fantasy Girls, but it had no links for Audrey to do her escort work. Terry then said it's a corn site and she had done corn before. She advised Paul to bring a photo of Audrey to one of those video stores and ask the clerks if they knew her. She said her corn name was Audrey Allman. He went to the store, and a tall, gangly young man with unwashed hair and glasses asked him if he could help him. "Do you recognize this woman from any movies?" Paul asked, and handed him a photo of Audrey. "He's never seen her." Then the second employee also didn't recognize her. A female employee was approached by Paul, and she looked at the photo. "Yes, that's Audrey Allman," she said with certainty. She remembered her films from stocking shelves where she used to work at another video store. "Do you remember any of the titles she was in?" Paul asked. No, she said she didn't remember titles, just faces. But that was definitely Audrey Allman. "Can you run her name through your computer?" No, they could only search titles. They advised him to search online. He checked the other video store, but found nothing. He finally searched online, but found nothing but a computer virus from the dodgy sites. Paul called the major newspaper in Palm Beach and left a message to speak to someone in the investigative department. Bob called him and told him the odd deposits to Audrey's account were cash deposits, and one for $200 from the 70-year-old man must have been the standard fee for a hooker. There was also a check to Audrey from a trust fund. In total, the cash came to $40,000. Audrey had another lawyer because the first one quit due to ethical reasons, so there was a delay in the proceedings. Paul found in her bank statements that she had a trip to Las Vegas where she spent $1,515.76 at Neiman Marcus, with $1,112.63 for a pair of Jimmy Choos. The plane ticket was $632, and Paul assumed her trick paid for the food and hotel. He emailed the information to his lawyer, and they were ready to confront Audrey. Bolstered by his lawyer's confidence, Paul contacted Vice again and met with Agent Hunter. He gave him a presentation with all of his documents. "Here they are, Agent Hunter, the pre-August 1st documents showing that Audrey Munson is a liar and a con artist, and the post-August 1st documents, which prove she's the madam of a large hooker ring." Paul said she brought in $40,000 in a period of almost 3 years, from January 1st, 2007 to August 10th, 2009, and the shoes she bought, which was inconsistent for a stay-at-home mom. This is what Paul said Agent Hunter told him. "Mr. Goldman, the work you've done is very impressive," he said, looking up at me for the first time since we began the interview. "You've saved me months of work. From what I see, this is a very large hooker ring with interstate connections." His eyes returned to the bank statements while rubbing the back of his neck. "I'll meet with you again tomorrow." He then claimed a case was opened and a matrix report was started on Audrey. When the agent began a search on Audrey Munson, he came up with an associate of hers named Jimmy Chow, a known recreational substances dealer. He also said Audrey had a rap sheet in other states but did not say what the charges were for. Paul was shocked but not surprised because he knew she was capable of anything, and the agent warned him not to make his motives known because she was dangerous. Paul then returned to his investigator, Joyce. He said in his book, "There is no doubt in my mind that Audrey was an actively working hooker who was helping to run a large ring, which is why I was becoming more and more frustrated over not being able to witness, photograph, or record any of her actions, leading credence to that knowledge." Bob was calling him to inform him of Audrey's schedule, which he knew from sharing custody of Tommy. As reported from Joyce, Audrey met with Royce at the Horseshoe, a nightclub. The investigator she sent, not her, said the club was packed so he couldn't take any photos. At around 11:30 p.m., a man asked Royce a question, and Royce said, "Offer $250 and see if she will take it." Audrey danced with the guy and they kissed. Then she put his number in her phone. They left separately, and the investigator could not follow her but returned to her apartment and reported she was not there. "Wow," Paul exclaimed. Joyce said it was enough evidence to convince the judge that Audrey was a hooker. Paul had his attorney subpoena any company he believed Audrey might have done business with, including a rent-a-car, a bank, and a phone company, and a brokerage firm. He knew Audrey was hiding $900,000 somewhere because his pet psychic told him, and yes, that's a lot of money, but Paul said he assumed she had been a hooker for 5 years and she could have accumulated that much, if not more. Another mediation between them was a waste of time, and Audrey refused to sit with Paul. Bob and Paul found out she was talking to a man named Mark Rogers, and he was approached and given the whole dossier on Audrey. Apparently, Mark ended their relationship. Paul's attorney called Agent Hunter, and he said he had little resources to investigate, but if Paul saw her at a hotel, to give him a call. Paul came to two possible conclusions. He really doesn't have the resources to investigate. He was investigating and couldn't give out any information, or he had been paid off to stop the investigation. Paul decided it was time to go to the feds, the FBI. He called and talked to an agent and gave him the whole story. He walked into the FBI office and saw a photo of Osama bin Laden on the wall. He then realized they had bigger problems to deal with when he was approached by two men. They listened to Paul explain his whole story and didn't bother to take notes or take their eyes off of him. One agent asked him if he had any proof she took money for Smex. He told him about the $250 deal in the nightclub. He said that seemed to satisfy the agents. One agent wrote out a complaint form for the PIMPS, Royce Rocco, and that 70-year-old man who owned the rental house, plus unnamed ones in New York and Chicago. One agent said they would make Royce talk. How? Paul said. He would certainly lie to them. He was facing significant prison time, and he'd talk, the agent assured him. This woman must be stopped, the other agent said. There were children involved. When did this happen? Paul did not let the agents know one of his sources was a pet psychic. He also asked about their professional opinion about the local cops, and he said they grinned in a way that gave him the answer he wanted. He was told they would give the information to the unit that dealt with this, and they would call him. They never called. Paul called one of the agents who he previously talked to, and he said he passed the information on and said goodbye. With that, he decided to kickstart the investigation by getting an investigative reporter involved. He left a message for Jim Wilson at Palm Beach Post, and he called Paul back the next day. He gave him the shortened version of his story, and Jim agreed to meet with him. Paul noticed that Jim looked scruffy, and he said his sandy hair hadn't seen a brush since the security guard had last seen Clark Kent. Paul pictured a big newsroom filled with reporters typing away on typewriters. Jim told him they use these strange things called computers now, and Clark Kent wasn't in that day. He interrupted Paul during his storytelling to question him and take copious notes. He seemed interested in what he was saying. Finally, Paul said to him, "Not to tell you your business, Jim, but why don't you use the angle of a woman who marries men to steal their assets and, by the way, spends her weekends as a hooker? I'm telling you, uncovering the inner workings of a hooker ring by the husband of a madam, you'll win the Pulitzer," I predicted with a smile. Jim told him that they didn't have the resources to investigate something like this. Paul wanted to know what they could do, and Jim offered to make some phone calls and background checks. He also said he would talk to some tricks. That's what Paul said he called them, tricks. Jim promised to call Paul to keep him informed. As he was leaving the building, Paul was tempted to ask the security guard when Clark Kent would return. Paul then contacted an investigative journalist he saw on Channel 12 News named Mia O'Shea. After telling her the whole story, she offered heartache for the kids because somehow children became involved with it, sympathy for Paul, and anger towards Audrey, which must have thrilled him, but explained she could not cover the story out of fear of being sued. She did offer to cover his trial in Bob's too, and she asked a question that stunned Paul. I take it Audrey was really great in bed, huh? Basically, he answered she was until the money ran out. For all the work Paul had in finding someone to uncover Audrey, he was able to get nowhere. But he said he was still brainstorming ways. He said they had a joint laptop, and he noticed just like with the phone, Audrey was always on it. He looked up computer repair in the yellow pages to find a computer geek named Sam who was able to run a software program and pull information from the laptop. He found a to-do list Audrey wrote, and this is a conversation Paul said happened between this guy Sam, who he never met before, and himself. Sam, why would Audrey have Expedia on a to-do list for February? We took our trip to California in January. Was she planning another trip in February? To where? I don't know, Paul, Sam responded. Look at that second item. Looks like she was getting 2 debit cards for business and wanted to make sure the statements were sent to her trailer in Stewart, not my house, where I might see those additional bank accounts. From what you tell me, Audrey claimed to have no other job besides being a stay-at-home mom. Why would she possibly need 2 business cards? Sam asked. That's a great question, Sam, was all I said, and my eyes moved on to the third item listed as savings. You know, Sam, Audrey told the judge that she lived on a fixed income of $1,600 a month in child support. If that was really the case, how could she save $501, and why was she giving it to her mother? I shook my head in confusion. Then I saw the fourth and fifth items, which proved once and for all that Audrey did have other phones in addition to the AT&T phone she claimed under oath to be her only phone. My private eye videotaped Audrey using 2 phones, one black and one red. In the tape, she used the black one as a walkie-talkie, just like I had my business to talk with my partner Daniel when he was in the field. Mine was a Nextel. In 2008, Nextel was the only company that had walkie-talkie phones, Sam added. It appears she wanted to upgrade her Nextel and maybe buy another phone, a T-Mobile. Paul also found where Audrey applied for FEMA assistance, and she paid her father for rent while living in their condo, and she claimed rent where her trailer was. He also found 5,000 web pages she searched through, including Jewish Singles, Fast Cupid, and Nerve.com. He found out on Nerve.com she had a profile, Lady Audrey 3. She did all this 5 days after they closed equity on their California home. She also had 3 accounts on Expedia, and Paul believed that helped her with her work. Paul also broke into her email account and read her emails to Royce. I shouldn't have called you, but the baby was ill, and for some reason I think of you as an integral part of him. I love and miss you very much. On August 5th, 2007, during their engagement, I know you love to be a control freak, but you don't set the rules. I will talk to whoever I feel is necessary to straighten out the lies you tell people about me and us. That is so wrong for you to do, but it makes you look good, I guess, to say these things. We will never be done because it's out of our hands. All of this was your problem. You should have told her long ago. You hurt everyone with your lies and cheating. You need help. I will always love you, and we will always be part of one another, whether you like it or not. I am so angry and frustrated with you right now and have nothing positive to say. I will keep my calls and comments upbeat, but inside me is nothing but negativity towards the way you handle your relationships. You can run for now, but I'll be back one day because we belong together, whether we like it or not. On September 12th, 2007, 6 days before the wedding. I will keep calling and I will come get you again. You can't run. We belong together. As for the others, they keep me busy during the week, but my mind is always on you. Please stop being so mean. I love you and you love me, and that's that. I'm sorry for the Cassandra issue, but you really pushed me with the 2-year anniversary issue. Please calm down. We need each other. On September 14th, 2007, 4 days before the wedding. Your funds were put into the bank on Friday by Jack. I also rented the car, and they charged your card the $250, and I paid the rest. Miss your son daily. On October 29th, 2007, I am currently ill with a chest cold, and everybody knows I have a big one. I do miss you, but I am torn by my needs. I know you love me, but I am crushed that you are too stubborn to say the words. I know you used to, and it's time for you to do it again. I am full of love and want to be surrounded by love, mutual giving and sharing. You can do this. Please try. And then there's the money thing. I love you and need you. Always, Audrey. On November 29th, 2007, 2 months after the wedding. Why can't you reciprocate the unconditional, monogamous love that your mother put in my heart for you? On February 9th, 2008, 4 months after the wedding. There is no place I'd rather be than in your arms, 24/7, 365, and you know it. It is you who leaves me. It is you who never tells me that you love me. It is you who never kisses me first. It is you who rarely touches me first. It is you who doesn't want a committed relationship. It is you who doesn't want to live together. It is you who doesn't even acknowledge me as your girlfriend, best friend, lover, life partner, significant other, and the one day wife. It is you who tells everyone that I'm crazy. It is you who loves to be with me but isn't in love with me. I ask you over and over to commit to a lifetime of us. You know your answer. I live with it every day. Pain, pain, pain. I am willing to make all the changes you ask, especially if it means eternity with you, but you can't even begin to acknowledge us. October 5th, 2008, shortly after they reconciled and were back to living together. Are you prepared for the storm? You need to make plans ASAP to go to your parents' vacation place in the Carolinas. It's coming straight for us, and so far has no plans to turn. Go to the bank and get at least $2,000 in 20s and smaller and fill your vehicle with gas. Paul said he then realized Audrey was not in love with him and never was. He came across information about different bank accounts he didn't know about, different social security numbers, and an email to a boyfriend named Tony where she offered to contribute up to $200,000 for a house they could buy together. There was also an email back and forth between herself and Royce about bringing a friend over after Tommy went to sleep, and an email to Joe Munson cussing him out for not bringing the children to her in time. There were possible 4 other men she sent very sexy emails to, and he called them her potential victims. They were emails to family members who were helping her out financially with child custody fight, and other emails to Royce where Audrey referred to him as her soulmate and she loved him unconditionally. It only enraged him, and he couldn't wait to face her in court. Bob faced Audrey in court 3 days before Paul, and Paul was there as a witness and support for Bob. Bob's attorney decided later not to put Paul on the stand, which bothered him. Paul said He had plenty to tell the court about Audrey, like how she had Tommy sleep on the laundry room floor with only a towel when all three children were together. He said he gave Audrey disgusted looks as the court order investigator reported she was an unfit mother, a liar, and a sociopath. Three other boyfriends of Audrey's also testified in court. Bob's trial would not be resumed for 3 months, and Paul returned to the Jupiter Police Department to talk to Agent Hunter. When he found out Hunter wasn't there, he demanded to speak with whoever was in charge of Vice. Paul was told the case was closed, but the sergeant said it was still open. Since it was ongoing, he couldn't give him any information. He said he was expecting a resolution within 30 days. He imagined what Audrey's and Royce's mugshots would look like and how he would celebrate her undoing. 2 weeks later, Paul received an email. Due to a lack of investigative evidence regarding crimes occurring within our jurisdiction, we are closing the case. Please feel free to contact me if and when you have any information relevant to crimes occurring within the city of Jupiter. Paul said he felt like he was on a roller coaster ride. He reported her for welfare fraud because she reported $400 a month in child support from Joe Munson, but not the $1,200 a month from Bob Thompson. Paul claimed she owed the welfare department $11,000. Paul started telling her about the hooker evidence, and she said that wasn't her department. Paul said he wanted to meet with the Florida Division of Law Enforcement, and she said she would set up that appointment. She set up an appointment for the next day, and Paul brought a copy of all the evidence. They told him they usually don't bother with women who sell themselves for money and focus on crimes of higher nature like gangs and recreational substance sellers. Paul says there were children involved and pointed to Audrey's 3 children. He told him they would be a hero to those children. Paul then called the Spencer County Police Department, even if they did have ties to Royce and by extension Audrey. He told the operator he had information on a large hooker ring operating in Spencer County and was directed to speak to a lieutenant. How did you get this information? He asked Paul, and he said he was married to the madam. He was told they were at work putting things together and Internal Affairs would be calling him soon. Paul feared retaliation and thought his body would be found floating in the Everglades. He forced himself to eat and watch a lot of TV, something he did often. Then he got the idea of taking Royce's trash from watching Access Hollywood, where they went through celebrity garbage cans. He called his lawyer and he told him it was legal, but he was warned that Royce was supposed to be dangerous, and what if he got caught? Paul decided he wouldn't be caught, and he paid a babysitter to watch Johnny while he went to Royce's house to get his garbage. He put on latex gloves and finally found an airline ticket with a fax that said, "My name is Albert Chang, and I am inquiring about a visa request and passport sent to you 2 months ago by overnight courier. I am now becoming concerned as your website indicated that 3 to 5 work days is all that is required. Please see my itinerary and my flight schedule for the 18th of this month. I ask that you please help me in this moment of concern with your kind reply. Thank you, Albert Chang." Paul said it was proof Royce was involved in forgery. He was forging papers, visas, and passports for people to enter the country. He found a wrinkled up photo of a young Asian girl, and he thought it would be used for a passport. Royce was importing women from Asia into his ring. Paul saw on the news Asian women forced into human trafficking. There was also a ticket envelope from United Airlines and a receipt from a perfume store at a Singapore airport. There was a cell phone receipt bought by Susan Wright. He also found Royce's cell phone bill. He Googled the numbers and found a number for land in Poland for sale, calls to New York, calls to Audrey and other women. There were calls to men in Spencer County. He found an email listed on Albert Chang's fax, and it went to a Christian organization with offices all over the U.S. and Canada. Chang was head of one office in Royce's town. This is what Paul decided in his book. Royce gets the names of the trick from Chang, who perhaps is the owner of a website where men request hookers. He takes these names and numbers and passes them on for servicing. Royce keeps the tricks from his area and has his own girls servicing them, thereby cutting out the middleman in his or her 20% cut. Then he gives the other tricks to Audrey for herself and her girls. Amazing how he and the investigative journalist both refer to women as tricks, phrasing from old movies, crime movies about the mob. What about Albert Chang, the Asian girl, in the Christian connection? Paul asked himself. Could it be simply a coincidence that Albert Chang flew all the way from Hong Kong, requested a passport and visa for a girl for Royce, just to work for $8 an hour for a nonprofit Christian group? That's doubtful. So what was going on? Was he a fool? This investigation first began out of anger and revenge. He had wanted to hurt Audrey. As things progressed, however, Paul claimed his motives became less about retaliation and more about doing what is just and right. It became about wanting Johnny to see his father as someone of courage and resolve. He said Johnny would never understand it now, but someday he would know. Someday he would understand what Paul had done and what he risked. Paul waited all day for the police to call, and when he finally did, he asked if he could speak to the head of Vice or Internal Affairs. It was neither, just a lone-time detective named Damien Walker. He agreed to meet Paul at a park, and Paul said they could take a bench near Audrey and her girls at their weekly meeting. Instead, they met in the parking lot. After he hung up, Paul realized if they were on the take, they could take him out someplace and end his life. He met with 3 guys sitting in a green SUV wearing sunglasses. He was instructed to retell his story. He handed them a photo of Audrey, and Damien said he knew her from women he saw meeting at the park, and he ran their car tags. He gave them a copy of his evidence and asked when they would be able to arrest and convict them. He was told women who sell their bodies in hook or rings were hard to prove, and if they were running a dating service, it's not illegal to have someone go over to your house as an escort and get paid. That's how 200 escort services in Florida operate. Paul was told to be optimistic, and that was it. On March 21st, 2010, Paul had his 5th reading with Terry. She told him because he started the investigation about Audrey, the way she would eventually leave this world had changed, and he may have already altered her destiny. He wanted to know if she would prey on other men for the next 20 years, and she said Audrey would get a lot of time in prison for conspiracy. She told him he was a victim, but he was a victim no more. He was becoming empowered, and his transformation was a story itself. Terry said the organization Audrey is part of would not go after him, but after her. She said Paul was scary in his empowerment. When Paul asked her about the things he saw in Royce's trash, she told him the girl is someone who sells her body for money, and she was from Southeast Asia. She was already a girl in Hook King, and they brought them to the U.S., gave them new identities, and put them to work. The ring was nationwide. They needed more and more girls, and their base is in England. Royce was head of it, and behind it is a corporation controlled by the mob. She saw victory for Paul in court, but there was a bigger picture in making his information about Audrey go public. She said this net of people, the police, the FBI, the IRS, were closing in on her. She told him to be patient, and she told him about his reincarnation. Paul's divorce trial was on April 5, 2010. As he entered the courthouse, he saw the investigative reporter, Maya O'Shea, setting up with a cameraman. He begged her to be at the trial, and she kept her word. He saw Audrey, and she was dressed very demurely in a navy conservative dress and wide-rimmed glasses Paul said she only used when driving. Paul called her a financial predator, in addition to being a common ho-ho and a madam to boot. Audrey's lawyer said, "Your Honor, this is a story of a typical marriage gone wrong. We want half equity in Paul Goldman's Florida houses. In addition, because of Florida's presumption of gift statute, we claim that the California house was a gift from Mr. Goldman to Mrs. Munson, and we want half of it as well. We also want half the money in his business and personal checking accounts. And finally, we want Mr. Goldman to pay my client's legal fees." As for Paul's lawyer, he said, "Your Honor, we will show that Mrs. Munson married Mr. Goldman solely for his money and defrauded him before the marriage by telling him she was caring for her grandmother in Cocoa Beach. She created two fictitious entities and used them to steal money from Mr. Goldman during the marriage. She had a boyfriend on the side during their entire marriage, and although this is a touchy subject, it appears her boyfriend is also her PIMP, Royce Rocco, and Audrey Munson is a working hooker." Paul said he looked at Audrey and she didn't budge. Paul's attorney called an investigator who worked with the investigation service Paul hired to testify about the $250 offer when Audrey and Royce went to a nightclub. But he was not the investigator who was working that night, and the judge sustained the objection by Audrey's attorney because he could not testify about what he didn't hear himself. Paul said he paid out $10,000 for their work, and he was furious. Bob Thompson also testified for Paul and stated Audrey wanted her name on the property he owned, and she lied a lot. When Audrey took the stand, she conceded that she didn't contribute anything to the down payment of the California townhouse, but said she looked at the house online with Paul and was there during the closing. She said purchases made in Las Vegas were for a friend. Paul said she kept her closet locked during the marriage, but without a doubt, what he found attractive was her beauty and how polished she looked in designer clothes. Audrey was asked about charges she made in Jupiter when she sent emails to Paul claiming she was with her grandmother in Cocoa Beach. She also created an entity, FHLC, to get nearly $7,000 from Paul. She said she did it because Paul kicked them out of their house, but she created the entity a month before, and it was possible she did it during one of the times Paul threatened to kick her out. The lawyer brought up the emails wanting her name on Paul's assets and her profile on Nerve.com, opened 5 days after the California property was closed on, and she listed herself as single. Her application for welfare was also brought up, and she was appealing a ruling that decreased her welfare benefits. He brought up assets she had, but she did not respond. During a lunch break, her attorney was interviewed by Maya O'Shea, and he called Paul delusional that Audrey was involved in a hooker ring, and even if she was, it had no bearing on what they were in court for. Paul and his lawyers were interviewed later, and they both said they believed Audrey sold her body for money. Paul was angry at his lawyer for not going after Audrey, but his lawyer said the judge would see the truth. After lunch, Audrey read the email she sent to Royce, declaring her love and devotion to him, even as she was married to Paul. She even had a trip with Royce while married to him. On April 5th, 2010, Paul was on the stand and he talked about being born in Rhode Island, achieving his MBA, moving to California, and he didn't want to enter his father's business, going to Russia, marrying Talia, and the birth of his son Johnny. He said he divorced and moved to Florida, where he joined Jewish Singles. He met Audrey, and she was all he was looking for, smart, attractive, and family-oriented. Then he completed the story where Audrey wanted her name on his assets and how she conned him. Then his business failed when Daniel left with a ton of money. Then he said he had a wake up call and knew it was the turning point in his life. He wrote, I can no longer live the same way I've been living the first 45 years of my life. I could continue to be a patsy, a wimp, a mark, or find the inner strength to protect myself, my assets, and my Johnny from Audrey, the sociopath who would, without any emotion or remorse, take everything from us. Then Paul explained how he learned Audrey was a madam and a hooker with Pimp Royce and others in a ring of women who sell their bodies for money, and he hired private investigators to get proof. Audrey's lawyer objected, and the judge sustained, but Paul kept yelling. Finally, Audrey's lawyer questioned him and brought up an email where Paul said he could afford to support a family since he was making $200,000 a month gross. So, Paul said, Audrey was being honest. She was looking for a man to financially take care of her, and he was refusing to pay the price after buying her. Then her attorney read a love letter Paul wrote to Audrey, and Paul's attorney objected by saying when Paul was writing love letters to Audrey, she was writing them to Royce. Paul's attorney closed by saying Audrey contributed nothing to the down payment of the California townhouse. In total, they spent 56 days together as husband and wife. The rest of the time, they were separated or Audrey was away from their home. The judge found Audrey lied, and she had assets beyond what she claimed. She entered the marriage not for love, but for money, and each person had to pay their own attorney's fees. Audrey received nothing, and Paul felt victorious. Paul wrote this in his book. A lot of what Terry Lynn predicted came true as well. At our first reading, Terry said that Audrey would never settle and would take the case all the way to court. Then 3 months before I got the phone logs with their hundreds of calls to Royce hotels and different men, Terry implied that Audrey was a hooker. During that first reading, when I asked Terry why Audrey wouldn't settle, she said it was because Audrey looked at it, the marriage, like ho-hoing. She gave you smacks, and so she deserved to be paid. At the time, I thought Terry was making an analogy, so I didn't take those words literally. And finally, Terry was right about the outcome of my trial. That night, I slept better than I had in a very long time. For Bob's trial to get custody of Tommy, Paul called him on May 8, 2010 to see how it went. Bob's lawyer decided not to use his private investigator, and the judge only wanted to know how Tommy was. Bob's lawyer said fine, but he would get worse as he grew older. The ruling was delayed for another 5 weeks, and Bob wasn't sure of the outcome. After that 5 weeks, Bob received full custody due to Audrey's unwillingness to communicate with Bob concerning Tommy, her history of fraudulent activity, the social investigator's view that Audrey was a pathological liar, and the revolving relationship she was in. However, Audrey would still have unsupervised overnight visits with Tommy. Paul was shocked she was given that time with her son, but thought he had seen the last of Audrey. He was wrong. Paul received another phone call from Bob on May 27, 2010. He said Audrey had been arrested and Joe was told to pick up the kids since she would be in jail overnight. What did they get her on? Paul asked. Fraud? Hooking? Neither. She was arrested for assaulting Paul at the shop and go. They ran into each other at a convenience store, and Audrey hit him in the chest with her purse and walked off. Paul made a report and said the box boy witnessed it. Well, he thought it was better than nothing. Paul called the welfare office and wanted an update, but they couldn't tell him anything. So he went on the police website to see her mugshot. Paul sold his Florida homes and rented out his California townhouse, and he felt he needed another fresh start. He moved to Rhode Island with his son, and he worked at an insurance company owned by his family. He still kept in touch with everyone he pulled into his investigation and still believed there was enough information that the cases were ongoing. Paul said he woke up one morning and decided to look for the adult movie Audrey was in, but he found it under her real name, Audrey Munson. She was in her early 20s, and it was called Fast Times at Amsterdam High. He knew Bob wanted to move Tommy with him to Connecticut, so he sent the DVD to Bob's attorney. Paul had a sixth reading with Terry, the pet psychic, on April 26, 2011. He was upset there was no arrest from this hooking ring investigation. She said it was up to God, and he told her she was correct about the adult movie Audrey worked in. He said he found one movie, but decided she was making movies with an S, and she was hooking before she married Joe, and after the divorce, she continued the work. Terry told him there would be arrests in 6 to 8 months. She said Homeland Security was involved, and Bob's attorney was bothered about Paul getting all the accolades over the case. With that, Terry told him goodbye, and Paul looked at returning to the life he ended up in that he was forever trying to flee. So he found another way to start over. His real name is Paul Finkelman, and he finished his book Duplicity in 2009 and published it on Amazon under the alias Paul T Goldman. He made the rounds in particular on a podcast because his divorce attorney ran a broadcast, of course, and this story would gain power in that platform. In 2012, he contacted a director, Woliner, for what Paul had hoped to be a blockbuster film, and he wrote the screenplay for it himself. There were no offers for a movie, and the director remained with the project for a decade until Peacock picked up a straight-to-series order with Seth Rogen as executive producer. It was premiered on January 1st, 2023, and the series delved into the reality underneath the story Paul told in his book. He said something in the series he believed about himself. I'm not like other people. My mind in my head does not exist. The entire world is an illusion. Everything is a projection of the mind. It's not real. It's like a movie. The same delusional world of websites, blogs, and forums is shared by many in the incel and grifter community. They refer to the movie The Matrix, and people are trapped in a simulated reality, and everyone is forced into a dystopian future. These incels and grifters refer to themselves as the rebellion against the machine forcing everyone down, but they are in fact the regime attempting to keep others down, and they believe by doing so they will be the ones to float to the top of the patriarchal hierarchy. The miniseries had scenes recreated from Paul's book, but also had the behind the scenes shots in this metaverse existence where Paul was allowed to play himself. There were also real people in Paul's life who were interviewed, and it became apparent early on that the reality Paul claimed to live through was not accurate. Paul's first wife was referred to in the book as Talia, but in real life her name is Galina Livlana Kremlin, and she is a geriatrician in San Diego, California, and she received her MD in Moscow in 1997 before meeting Paul in 1999. She's very successful in her own life. Paul, by the way, was 41 in 1999. In the book, Galina was miserable and impossible for Paul to deal with. He even wrote she threw food at him when he confronted her with a divorce. But in truth, Paul acknowledged that didn't happen. They recreated the scene together, and Galina was not cruel at all. She had a green card and didn't have to stay married to Paul, but wanted to for the good of their son. She didn't want to raise him in a broken home. It was Paul who wanted the divorce, and it wasn't to stand up for Johnny. It was because he wanted, quote unquote, companionship for himself. Galina and Johnny were together on the set, and they actually look like they have a caring relationship, and they look very much alike. Johnny would remain with Paul until he was 12, when he moved to be with his mother to further his education. Johnny said before his father remarried, he was just fine living with his father and didn't have any wishes for a new mom. He did have a mother completing her education and residency. Plenty of parents have to navigate different family structures because of changes in life and divorce, but they are still parents in unconventional family structures. Johnny did very well in the San Diego school system under the parenting of Galena. Paul sat near a pile of stuffed animals and appeared sad when he said Johnny didn't want his childhood toys anymore. He said Johnny grew up a lot and he was focused on business, but he didn't think Johnny was happy anymore because he grew up. An actor on the set said Paul was like a child. He saw Johnny was so serious. Paul said Johnny was so serious now. Johnny lived in India where he was running a startup and he said he was happy in his adult world. Paul didn't seem to understand how Johnny could find happiness in working as a small business co owner and just living a normal existence, so he created a fantastic world for him as a secret agent, just as Paul created one for himself. Of course, Paul got along with the actor playing Johnny, and he flirted with the much younger and married actress playing Svetlana in the series. Paul said he wanted a family, so he created one. Svetlana was transformed into a model, and when he met her this time, she didn't pull her hand back. They get back together in his book series, but in real life, Paul was still single. In his sequels to investigating the Hook ring, Audrey and Royce were assassinated on a boat blown to pieces by the mob. The mob hired a hitman to try to take Paul out, but he survived the plane crash and ended up in Moscow. Royce survived, and it was up to Paul to track him and the mob members down all over the world to bring them to justice. The director's team tracked down Royce Rocco, and his real name is John Cadillac McDaniel. Everyone who knew him called him Cadillac. He admitted he had dated Audrey at the time she was married to Paul, and her real name was Diana. He met her in Two Bazaar in Jupiter, and they went out for 5 years. He said it was exciting and 5 years of fun. Correction, it wasn't always fun, but it was always exciting. He said when it was no longer fun, he wasn't around. Cadillac wasn't sure if she was in love with him. She always wanted marriage, but he told girls up front that he wasn't interested in getting married. He told Diana to get married and just keep him as a boyfriend. Cadillac said he had no sympathy for Paul because he got what he deserved. Who gets married to someone after 3 months? Paul had the same problem in his prior marriage. He'll have the same track record in his life just like Diana. There will be multiple marriages and an unhappy life. Cadillac said he and Diana never had a hook her ring. He wasn't a pimp. He said Diana was different. She dated a lot of guys, but she didn't date for money. Those accusations are ridiculous. Cadillac said I'm a boat guy. He says Paul's book was a big fiction, and Diana let him know after reading it that he was in it. Then he found out from Paul why Diana was interested in Cadillac. Paul estimated he was worth $20 to $40 million. Paul was worried Cadillac would hire a hitman for 50 grand to unalive him. Diana met a woman in a park because the woman had a father who had dementia, and Diana was very spiritual and she was praying with her. Paul thought they were hookers and had the investigators follow them. Paul didn't believe it. It's Audrey, he said. It's just what she does. Cadillac also believed he knew why she called 10 girls and there were hundreds of calls to men. Diana was very jealous and she called around obsessed with John, or Cadillac. She'd get mad and make phone calls all night to everyone who knew Cadillac. The nightclub the investigator said they were at and offered $250 for, Cadillac never remembered even being there, and he certainly wasn't offering up his girlfriend at the time. Paul still would not believe it. Paul didn't mention getting a name from Diana's phone call list and writing a note to her parents about her being a SMEX worker. Paul sent the letter to Diana's parents in an attempt to make them think she was a hooker so they would stop supporting her and giving her resources like money to fight Paul and Bob. He typed it on a typewriter and threw it away so they wouldn't connect it to him. Paul also got a tech bro to help him get into her emails, which is a violation of her privacy. He said it was a gray area since he was her husband. He said he guessed her password because he was intuitive. It expressed how Paul saw women as inferior beings who were property of men when they married, and she wasn't entitled to rights of privacy from her husband. Diana married again after she divorced Paul. She was looking for vulnerable men so she could get money from them. In the lawyer's words, she's looking for someone who wasn't 100%, and she was preying on them. There were also multiple men she lived with, trying to convince them to turn over property to her. She wasn't necessarily a hooker, but she did exchange intimacy for money. She took advantage of people just to get by, and Paul went overboard with it. She had way too busy of a life to do what Paul said she was doing. Diana lost her parents, Richard and Carmen, in an unaliving of her mother, and then self-unaliving of her father. You understand. The police investigated the case, and Carmen had cancer, and they believed they didn't want to face the outcome of that. So Richard took his wife's life and then his own. Paul and his pet psychic blamed Diana, saying she unalived them for money, but there were cameras in the condo complex where they lived, and no one could get in and out without being seen. It's despicable and mean-spirited to accuse her of something she could not have possibly done. Terry, the pet psychic, was far more cruel than Paul made her out to be in the book. Paul wanted the investigators to do things that were not legal, and they dropped him as a client. Another investigator, a real scumbag, was hired and drained Paul for 30 grand. Paul said it was Diana's fault. The investigator did unethical things like entering Diana's property to film her through her bedroom window, and she charged Paul with harassment and stalking. The investigators never saw Diana do anything but normal stuff like going to the bank, and Paul would say she was depositing her hooker money. When he went through Cadillac's trash, he didn't know how Paul could bend things like that in his head. He thought he found an Asian girl who was being brought to America with 2 plane tickets, and she was given perfume as a way someone gives you something to make you stay quiet. It was a friend of Cadillac's who put out the trash. Paul thought it was a global child sex trafficking ring. He found an email for Robert Borelli. It's actually Anthony's Woliner, and he was responsible for taking the trash out. In 2007, he went to India, and he is ordained through a small local church called Family Worship Center, and he was doing missionary work through them. He went to China and Singapore too. He had papers from his trips and he threw them away. The Indian girl was in an orphanage, and he met the pastor in India who adopted 17 children from the tsunami who were physically, mentally, and psychologically damaged. Somewhere he had several hundred photos of children in need. Paul kept turning off the audio as he listened to Anthony explain what happened because he didn't want to hear the truth, and the director told him to listen to it in full. The perfume was a body shea butter for Anthony's wife of 39 years, not to entice a woman to come with him. There was not 2 plane tickets. It was 1 flight and it was connecting. Paul was rather reluctant to admit he was wrong, even when the director said he believed him. He accused innocent people of criminal acts, and he seemed more upset that it ruined his Chronicle series rather than hurting other people. He said he didn't use real names in the book, but Anthony said Paul took a photo of him in an agency that assists homeless people. He put it on Twitter with the comment, "We'll start with this animal," alleged, of course, sex trafficker Albert Borelli. Finally, Paul gave some kind of apology on camera. He wanted to be seen as a hero with integrity and always right, but he was very wrong. Paul was paying people $50 each to sit at one of his lectures for his book, and one woman in the audience pointed out that the Russian bride business was a form of human trafficking. He was momentarily silenced, then assumed since the women were married off, that meant it wasn't women selling their bodies for money or security. Paul was wrong. The red pill community complained that marriage is an institution set up to protect women, but historically, marriage is structured to promote patriarchy, where there are entrenched gender divisions of labor, and women's fertility and sexuality are controlled by men. It's a transaction rather than a romantic partnership. Research indicates men benefit from marriage through increased wealth, better health, and more personal time, where for women, all this decreases. The hypergamy, or the practice of marrying a spouse of higher status, misogynists point out to being natural for women, is simply women selling themselves to the highest bidder. The media trainer hired for the series had to tell Paul not to call women hookers and call them sex workers. She asked Paul if he didn't like women who did that type of work, but he said he didn't like Diana had tricked him. It's obvious Paul didn't respect women and he didn't trust them, and that was before Diana. After her, he became even worse. The media trainer pointed out that a woman had a right to do what she wanted with her body. Paul said nothing. Paul's father did not show him a lot of love growing up. It was not in his character. He never told him he loved him, while Paul always told Johnny he loved him. Did it shape Paul's personality at all? Maybe just a little, he concluded. His father, Gerald Finkelman, said Paul was his own person. He was in his own world. He was much different than his brothers, and there was no changing him either. Gerald set him up in a wholesale insurance business. Paul hated it. He went on his own to do something different. He's always moving from one spot to another, from one side of the country to another, from one project to another project, and that's Paul. He was just this average, boring, unattractive guy until he came across this international crime case, and it gave him purpose. Paul referred to himself as a warrior without emotions, and the director asked like a sociopath, and Paul just looked at him. It's highly possible he may be somewhere on the spectrum. Paul is off, but he may not have gone so far down the rabbit hole without the push of the pet psychic and that scumbag investigator. The director asked him if he thought he went too far harassing Audrey, or, Diana, her real name, and Paul said yes. It's what many incels get into with the red pill online communities and buying into grifts and believing these same things. Just like Paul, they want to become a warrior, not a wimp anymore. Paul's father called him a wimp growing up and told him he couldn't wallow in emotions. In the end, he said he supported what the director put in the series and could see it was a real story about his life. Paul summed it up by saying, "Life is so complicated. You think you know something, but you really know nothing." Maybe others can learn from his story, Paul's true story. On September 23, 2023, Paul's ex, Diana Johnson, sued Paul Finkelman, and the court initially dismissed the complaint with prejudice because it was a single publication rather than multiple publications, and the average person would not have known the real person since the fake name Audrey Munson was used with the first name Diana later on. It did not mention her by name, and her likeness was blurred. The series was a documentary series, a docudrama, which appeared to be fictionalized and dramatized, and it was sold as a descent of Paul Finkelman into fantasy and self-delusion. No reasonable and common-minded viewer would understand Finkelman's statements to be factual or credible. On December 3, 2025, Diana Johnson sued Paul Finkelman for 6 counts of defamation and 6 counts of conspiracy to defame. There was an argument by the plaintiff, Diana, that the miniseries was not a single publication with 6 episodes. Her real first name was also used in the miniseries. There is an intrinsic reference to her, and by coming forward and getting attention for himself, people know him, can find him, and also find out who she is. People who know her also know what Paul said about her. There were also dates of court hearings and news reports excerpts where Diana was seen. There was also a 2008 petition for injunction against domestic violence appellant filed in Palm Beach County against Finkelman. There was enough facts and references that Diana's identity could be found. So the saga between Paul and Diana is not over with yet, and perhaps being very similar in many ways, these two wouldn't have it any other way. It's like Cadillac noticed about them. They were two people very similar to each other in a cycle of unhappiness, and misery always loves company. Thank you for watching, and the next video will be Look What You Drove Me to Do, the case of Clara Harris and the sudden passion defense.